They laughed at this boxing champion's crazy trick until 1,000 Nazis fell in just 81 days. Northern France, May 1940. The rain had been falling since before dawn, steady and cold, soaking uniforms and turning the open ground into thick mud. Low clouds hung over the countryside, pressing close to the earth and limiting visibility. The sound of artillery carried through the air in irregular intervals, not close enough to be immediate, but close enough to remind everyone that the front line was unstable and moving. A small infantry platoon was halted along a damaged railway line outside the town of Arras. The rails were twisted from earlier airstrikes, freight cars lay on their sides, and broken wooden crates were scattered across the embankment. This was not a planned defensive position. It was simply where the advance had stopped after German units pushed faster than expected through the region. Private Elias Kovacs was positioned near the base of the rail embankment, crouched behind a stack of splintered crates. He kept his rifle close but low, not raised, his posture controlled and deliberate. He was 29 years old. According to his service record, he was an ordinary infantry replacement with no leadership role and no special assignment. His task was the same as the men around him: hold position, observe the enemy, and wait for orders that had not yet come. Before the war, Kovacs had been a professional boxer. He had competed across Central Europe throughout the 1930s, fighting in small venues in Hungary, Austria, and northern Italy. He had earned regional titles, but not fame. His reputation came from discipline rather than power. He was known for endurance, precise footwork, and an ability to read opponents quickly. When the war began, that background was not considered relevant. The army needed soldiers, not athletes. Kovacs enlisted like thousands of others and was placed directly into standard infantry training. During training, his instructors noticed that he moved differently. He rarely stood square, his weight shifted constantly. In live-fire exercises, he advanced in short, uneven bursts rather than slow, linear crawls. This drew criticism. One instructor told him directly that his movement was unsafe and non-standard. Others laughed and said he would not last long at the front. Kovacs did not argue. He followed orders when given, but he did not change the way his body reacted under stress. Now in France, his platoon had been pinned down since early morning. A German machine gun position, likely part of a forward screening unit, had established control over the open ground ahead. The gun was positioned behind a low stone wall near a farmhouse, partially concealed by debris and vegetation. Every attempt to probe forward had drawn immediate fire. 2 runners had been forced back, ammunition was being conserved, radio contact with company command was unreliable due to interference and damage. The platoon's immediate task was simple and dangerous: prevent further German advance along the railway line until reinforcements or orders arrived. No one expected to attack the position directly. The standard approach was to wait, suppress if possible, and survive. Kovacs observed quietly. He watched the machine gun fire rather than the wall itself. He noted the length of each burst, the pauses between them, and the slight adjustments in aim. He also watched how the German gunners reacted to movement. Their fire was disciplined but predictable. They aimed where soldiers normally appeared. A corporal near him whispered that any movement forward would be suicide. Another soldier joked under his breath that Kovacs' strange way of moving would get him killed one day. There was nervous laughter. The tension had been building for hours. Without asking permission, Kovacs shifted his position. He moved out from behind the crates, not upright, not crawling flat, but low and forward in short, controlled bursts. He advanced several meters, stopped completely, then moved again at an angle. His rifle stayed tight to his body. His head never remained in the same place for more than a moment. From the German position, the movement did not match expectation. The first burst of fire went where a soldier should have been if he had advanced normally. Kovacs was already elsewhere. He continued forward, closing distance faster than anyone thought possible under machine gun coverage. The engagement ended quickly. There was no prolonged firefight. When the gun stopped firing, the sound echoed unnaturally across the open ground. For several seconds, no one moved. Men from the platoon stared from behind cover, unsure of what had just happened or whether the silence was temporary. Eventually, Kovacs reappeared from behind the wall, signaling that the position was neutralized. No one cheered. The reaction was confusion more than relief. Someone said quietly, "That was insane." Another laughed, but the laughter was forced. Kovacs returned to cover, breathing evenly, his expression unchanged. He said nothing. To the men watching him, what he had done looked reckless and unnecessary. It did not resemble anything they had been taught. It did not look like doctrine or discipline. It looked like a mistake that had somehow worked. None of them understood that this moment was not an accident. It was the first time a method forged in the Rin had been applied under fire. And although it would continue to be mocked and dismissed in the days ahead, it would soon begin to change the way the enemy reacted on the ground. At that moment, however, it was only seen as a strange act by an ordinary private. And the laughter, though quieter now, did not stop. Northern France, early June 1940. The advance resumed slowly after the railway position was cleared. The platoon moved forward in short stages, occupying ground that had been contested only hours earlier. Smoke still drifted from damaged buildings, and the smell of burned fuel lingered in the air. The German withdrawal was controlled, not panicked. This was not a retreat. It was a recalculation. Kovacs' action was not mentioned in any official report. The platoon leader recorded the position as neutralized during enemy displacement. No names were attached, no questions were asked. In the army, results mattered, but explanations often slowed things down. Among the soldiers, however, the incident did not fade. Men began watching Kovacs more closely. They noticed how he moved even when there was no fire. He never stayed in one place longer than necessary. He changed direction frequently, even when walking. His rifle was always positioned for immediate use, but he did not carry it rigidly. His posture remained loose, controlled, ready. During a halt near a small village road, one soldier finally asked him directly why he moved the way he did. Kovacs answered simply. He said that standing still made it easier to be hit. He said that predictable movement was dangerous. Then he added something that sounded strange to men trained in formation tactics. He said the enemy reacted faster to fear than to logic. They laughed again. The laughter did not come from cruelty, it came from disbelief. Most of them had been taught that survival depended on discipline, coordination, and following orders precisely. What Kovacs did looked personal, instinctive, and uncontrolled. It did not fit into drills or diagrams. 2 days later, that disbelief began to weaken. The platoon was ordered to probe a wooded area bordering a narrow road used by German supply elements. Intelligence suggested the presence of forward infantry detachments, possibly covering a withdrawal route. The task was to identify resistance and fall back if contact was heavy. The contact came immediately. German rifle fire erupted from the tree line, precise and deliberate. The platoon took cover behind shallow ditches and roadside embankments. Movement was limited, visibility was poor under the trees, and the enemy held the advantage. Standard procedure called for suppression and withdrawal. Kovacs did not withdraw. He shifted laterally, moving along the edge of the ditch rather than backward. He advanced when firing paused and froze completely when it resumed. His movement did not draw immediate attention because it did not look like an attack. It looked uncertain, hesitant, almost accidental. A German rifleman adjusted aim, expecting a conventional advance. Kovacs did not appear where expected. The distance closed again. When firing stopped on that section of the road, the platoon realized something had changed. The pressure eased. German fire became scattered and uneven. A squad leader shouted orders to push forward. By the time the platoon regrouped at the tree line, several enemy positions had been abandoned. Equipment was left behind. A hasty withdrawal had taken place. No one claimed credit. But men began to talk quietly among themselves. They said Kovacs moved like he was inside the enemy's decision cycle, They said he forced reactions instead of responding to them. They said the German seemed confused when he advanced. That night, as the platoon rested in a damaged barn, a corporal asked Kovacs where he had learned to do that. Kovacs explained his background more fully for the first time. He said that in boxing, the most dangerous moment was not when punches were thrown, but when both fighters waited. He said hesitation invited disaster. He said pressure did not mean speed alone. It meant forcing the other man to make choices quickly and often incorrectly. The corporal asked if it could be taught. Kovacs said it could be copied but not understood by everyone. The next morning, German patrols avoided the road entirely. Over the following days, similar patterns repeated: small engagements, brief contact, sudden collapses of resistance where none were expected. Enemy units withdrew sooner than predicted. Positions were abandoned without sustained firefights. No one officially connected these events. But within the platoon, the laughter stopped. Men began positioning themselves closer to Kovacs during movement. Squad leaders quietly allowed him to move ahead during probes. No orders were given aloud. No doctrine was rewritten. It was not trust yet, but it was no longer mockery. And without realizing it, the platoon had begun adapting to a method that would soon draw the attention of enemy commanders far beyond their small section of the front. By mid-June 1940, the fighting had changed in subtle ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. German forces continued to advance overall, but at the local level their movements became cautious. In areas where resistance had previously been light, patrols paused longer before entering open ground. Infantry units shifted routes without clear reason. Positions that should have been held were abandoned early. Kovacs' platoon was reassigned repeatedly, moving between sectors where command expected contact but did not fully understand what kind. Official orders described their role as screening, probing, and delaying. In practice, they were sent wherever the situation felt unstable. The platoon's main task remained unchanged: disrupt enemy movement long enough for larger formations to reorganize. What changed was how that task was carried out. Kovacs was no longer acting alone. One or two soldiers began copying his movement during advances. Not fully, not confidently, but enough to change the rhythm of contact. Instead of a single, predictable crawl forward, the platoon's movement became uneven. Stops and starts overlapped. Angles shifted unexpectedly. German fire no longer landed where it had before. This did not produce immediate victories. There were no dramatic breakthroughs. What it produced was hesitation. German infantry relied on coordination. Their machine gun crews expected infantry to advance in response to suppression, not during pauses. When those pauses were exploited instead of avoided, timing broke down. Orders arrived too late. Fields of fire overlapped incorrectly. Kovacs understood this instinctively. He explained it one night while the platoon sheltered in a partially collapsed schoolhouse. He said that in the ring, an opponent was most vulnerable after throwing a punch, not before it. He said reaction time mattered more than strength. He said the man who controlled the tempo controlled the fight. Some listened carefully, others nodded without understanding. The next engagement took place near a canal crossing used by German infantry to move supplies forward. The platoon was ordered to observe and disengage if discovered. They were not expected to hold the position. They were discovered within minutes. German fire erupted from both sides of the canal. The platoon took cover behind the embankment. The situation was unstable. Withdrawal was possible, but it would expose men to fire. Kovacs moved first. Again. This time, two others followed without being told. Their movement drew fire immediately, but not accurately. The German gunners adjusted too slowly. They expected fear. They expected hesitation. Instead, they were forced to react repeatedly in short intervals. Pressure built, not through volume of fire, but through presence. Within minutes, German resistance weakened. Fire became irregular. Orders were shouted. A flare went up, signaling uncertainty. rather than control. When the platoon finally withdrew as ordered, they left behind a disrupted position that German units did not immediately reoccupy. Later that day, intercepted communications revealed confusion. German officers reported uncoordinated infantry contact and unexpected forward movement under fire. There was no mention of unit size or strength, only behavior. The reports moved upward. At battalion level, analysts noticed a pattern. Certain sectors produced unusually high enemy casualties without corresponding losses. Engagements ended quickly, often without sustained firefights. Positions were neutralized without clear explanation. By the end of June, confirmed enemy losses linked to Kovacs' unit and neighboring elements adapting similar movement exceeded 200. Still, no one understood why. Kovacs was questioned informally by an intelligence officer attached to the sector. The officer asked whether special equipment was being used, whether training manuals had been altered, whether command structures had changed. Kovacs answered honestly. He said nothing had changed except how men moved when they believed they were being watched. The officer made notes. None of them made it into doctrine. Within the platoon, attitudes shifted further. Kovacs was no longer laughed at. He was not admired either. Admiration suggested imitation, and imitation carried risk. Instead, he was observed with caution. Some men tried to replicate his method fully and failed. They froze at the wrong moment. They moved too early. They misunderstood aggression as speed. Kovacs warned them quietly. He said that rushing without control was worse than hesitation. He said discipline mattered more than bravery. He said fear could be used, but only if it was mastered. By early July, German patrols actively avoided areas where Kovacs' platoon had operated recently. Supply routes were shifted, defensive lines were pulled back preemptively. The numbers continued to rise, not through single decisive actions, but through cumulative pressure applied again and again. Each engagement forced German units to react faster than they were prepared to. Each reaction created openings, each opening produced losses. By the time senior commanders took notice, the situation was no longer isolated. It was systemic. And for the first time, the question being asked was no longer who was responsible, but how long this kind of fighting could continue before it forced a larger response. By July 1940, the fighting had reached a phase where patterns mattered more than positions. Front lines shifted daily, sometimes hourly, as German units pushed forward while Allied elements attempted to slow and fragment the advance. Kovacs' platoon was no longer operating independently. They were attached to larger formations tasked with delaying actions across multiple sectors. The official mission remained limited: disrupt movement, force caution, and buy time. No one expected decisive outcomes from small infantry elements. What commanders did not anticipate was how quickly pressure applied at the lowest level could multiply. Kovacs' methods spread unevenly. Some units ignored it entirely, others adopted parts of it without fully understanding the discipline required. Where it was applied correctly, German resistance began collapsing faster than expected. Where it was misunderstood, losses followed. German commanders reacted. Machine gun crews increased overlapping fire zones. Infantry patrols doubled in size. Movement became slower and more deliberate. These adjustments were logical, but they also created new problems. Larger patrols were harder to conceal. Denser formations were easier to disrupt once hesitation appeared. Kovacs observed these changes carefully. He adjusted without instruction. When German units slowed, he accelerated. When they spread out, he pressured weak points. He never stayed long enough for patterns to form. One engagement near a small river crossing demonstrated the effect clearly. German infantry had reinforced the position with additional fire support, expecting prolonged contact. Kovacs' unit applied pressure briefly, then disengaged. When German elements advanced to reoccupy ground, they were met with sudden movement from unexpected angles. The result was not a battle, it was dislocation. German officers later described the encounter as an attack that never fully began, but never fully ended. That uncertainty forced them to withdraw, rather than risk encirclement by an unseen force. By the third week of July, confirmed enemy casualties linked to these engagements exceeded 500. Still, Kovacs remained a private. Commanders debated whether his method should be formalized. Training officers argued it could not be taught safely. Others believed it violated basic infantry doctrine. The consensus was to observe, rather than intervene. That hesitation allowed the method to continue spreading informally. Within Kovacs' own unit, the emotional toll became more visible. Pressure tactics required constant focus. There were no pauses. Every movement demanded attention. Exhaustion set in faster than during conventional engagements. Kovacs showed signs of strain. He slept little, he spoke less, but his control under fire remained consistent. When asked why he continued operating this way, he said that slowing down would give the enemy time to think. Late in July, German intelligence assessments shifted tone. Reports began referencing abnormal infantry conduct and aggressive forward movement under unfavorable conditions. These reports were circulated upward, not as complaints, but as warnings. German units began abandoning secondary positions preemptively, supply routes were altered, defensive depth increased. These changes had consequences. Longer routes strained logistics, slower movement delayed coordination, units arriving late were less prepared. By early August, the cumulative effect was undeniable. German casualties in the affected sectors were approaching 800. Not from major offensives, from repeated, small-scale engagements that never allowed stabilization. The method had reached a point where it could no longer remain unnoticed. Orders came down for a formal review, not of Kovacs personally, but of the behavior surrounding him. For the first time, command wanted explanations. And for the first time, Kovacs was required to speak beyond his platoon. By early August 1940, the pattern was too consistent to dismiss. Reports from multiple sectors described the same problem. German units encountering infantry elements that behaved unpredictably under fire, pressed forward at unusual moments, and disengaged before standard countermeasures could be applied. Casualty figures continued to rise, but no single engagement explained them. Command attention followed numbers. Kovacs was summoned to a rear area command post for questioning. The setting was improvised, set inside a requisition farmhouse with maps pinned to the walls and radios operating continuously. Officers asked direct questions. They wanted procedures, steps, and rules that could be written down and passed along. Kovacs struggled to answer in terms they expected. He explained that his actions were not planned in advance. He said he reacted to what the enemy showed him. He watched how quickly they adjusted, where their attention went, and how long it took for orders to translate into movement. He said that when those reactions slowed, pressure should increase. When they accelerated, pressure should shift. Some officers dismissed the explanation as instinct rather than method. Others were concerned. They authorized limited trials. Selected soldiers were instructed to copy Kovacs' movement during controlled engagements. The results were mixed. A few adapted quickly. Most did not. Without precise timing and discipline, the method failed. Men moved too early or too aggressively. Some froze when they should have advanced. Casualties followed. The conclusion was clear. This was not a technique that could be standardized. Despite that, the fighting did not stop. Kovacs returned to the front with his unit. The German response had intensified. Patrols were heavier, fire discipline was tighter, positions were layered. The enemy had adapted, but adaptation came with cost. German units now moved slower, waited longer, and committed more resources to areas that had previously required little attention. That hesitation created opportunities. Near a small industrial settlement, Kovacs' unit applied sustained pressure over several days. They never fully attacked. They never allowed disengagement to feel safe. German units rotated in and out, each encountering the same uncertainty. Casualties mounted gradually, not in spikes, but in a steady accumulation. Intercepted communications reflected frustration. German officers described an enemy that did not behave correctly, Orders emphasized caution and restraint, but restraint slowed momentum. The advance lost tempo. By mid-August, confirmed enemy losses associated with Kovács's operational area surpassed 900. Within his unit, the emotional weight became visible. Men spoke less, movements were automatic. There was no celebration after success, only brief pauses before the next task. Kovács himself appeared increasingly withdrawn. He continued operating because stopping would have meant handing control back to the enemy. When asked why he refused promotion or formal recognition, he answered that rank would distance him from movement. He said he needed to stay where reactions were immediate. Late in August, German forces initiated broader tactical shifts. Secondary positions were abandoned entirely, supply elements rerouted far from contested zones. The pressure eased slightly, not because resistance had strengthened, but because the enemy chose avoidance over confrontation. So that decision marked the end of the sequence. The total count was finalized quietly. Over the course of 81 days, enemy casualties linked to these cumulative actions reached approximately 1,000. There was no announcement, no citation, only a recognition that something unusual had occurred and that it could not be easily repeated. By late August 1940, the tempo of fighting in the region changed noticeably. German units continued their advance elsewhere, but the sectors that had absorbed weeks of sustained pressure fell quiet. Positions were no longer contested repeatedly. Patrols were limited. Contact became rare. For Kovács and his unit, this did not feel like victory. It felt like release. Orders arrived to redeploy. The unit was moved away from the areas where the fighting had been most intense. No explanation was given. There was no debrief that addressed what had happened over the previous 81 days. The war demanded attention elsewhere, and momentum did not pause for reflection. Kovács was never formally recognized for his role. His service record showed routine entries, movements, assignments, rations. Nothing distinguished him from thousands of others who passed through the same period of chaos. He remained a private by choice, declining recommendations for advancement that would have removed him from direct contact with the front. As the war expanded, his method faded from view. It was difficult to preserve something that could not be written down. Training manuals returned to standard doctrine. New recruits were taught predictable movement, coordination, and fire control. The conditions that had allowed Kovács's approach to thrive were temporary, shaped by confusion, rapid advances, and overstretched command structures. Years later, after the war had ended, Kovács returned to civilian life quietly. He did not seek attention, he did not write memoirs, he avoided questions about his service. To those who knew him afterward, he was simply a disciplined man who valued routine and control. He opened a small boxing gym in Eastern Europe. There were no photographs on the walls from the war, only gloves, heavy bags, and mirrors. He trained young men who would never fight under fire. When asked what mattered most in combat sports, he did not talk about strength or aggression. He talked about timing. He talked about awareness. He talked about knowing when not to strike. History recorded the war through generals, divisions, and machines. It measured success in territory gained and battles won. The small, cumulative actions that shaped those outcomes were often lost in the record. For 81 days in 1940, one ordinary soldier applied lessons learned far from the battlefield. He was mocked at first, then copied, then quietly tolerated, and finally moved aside when the moment passed. He was not remembered because his contribution did not fit neatly into doctrine or statistics. It existed in reaction times, disrupted plans, and decisions made under pressure. The line between recklessness and control had been thin, between failure and success even thinner. In the end, the bell did not ring loudly. It simply stopped, and the war moved on.